With the growth of freedom, classes come to be more open, that is, more based on individual traits and less upon descent. Competition comes actively into play and more or less efficiently fulfills its function of assigning to each one an appropriate place in the whole. The theory of a free order is that everyone is born to serve mankind in a certain way, that he finds out through a wise system of education and experiment what that way is, and is trained to enter upon it. In following it, he does the best possible both for the service of society and his own happiness. So far as classes exist, they are merely groups for the furtherance of efficiency through cooperation, and their membership is determined entirely by natural fitness. This ideal condition is never attained on a large scale. In practice, the men who find work exactly suited to them and at the same time acceptable to society are at the best somewhat exceptional, though habit reconciles most of us. And classes are never wholly open or wholly devoted to the general good. The problem of finding where men belong, of adapting personal gifts to a complex system, is indeed one of extreme difficulty, and is in no way solved by facile schemes of any sort. There are fundamentally only two principles available to meet it, that of inheritance or caste and that of competition. While the former is a low principle, the latter is also, in many of its phases, objectionable, involving waste of energy and apt to degenerate into anarchy. There are always difficulties on either hand, and the actual organization of life is ever a compromise between the aspiration toward freedom and the convenience of status. We may assume, then, that in contemporary life we have to do with a society in which the constitution of classes, so far as we have them, is partly determined by inheritance and partly by a more or less open competition, which is, again, more or less effective in placing men where they rightly belong. If classes are open and men make their way from one into another, it is plain that they cannot be separate mental wholes, as may be the case with castes. The general state of things becomes one of facile intercourse, and those who change class will not forget the ideas and associations of youth. Non-hereditary classes may have plenty of solidarity and class spirit. Consider, for instance, the medieval clergy, and their activity may also be of a special and remote sort, like that of an astronomical society, but after all there will be something democratic about them. They will share the general spirit of the whole in which they are rooted. They mean only specialization in consciousness, where caste means separation. The question whether there is or ought to be class consciousness in a democratic society is a matter of definitions. If we mean a division of feeling that goes deeper than the sense of national unity and separates the people into alien sections, then there is no such thing in the United States on any important scale, leaving aside the race question, and we may hope there never will be. But if we mean that along with an underlying unity of sentiment and ideals, there are currents of thought and feeling somewhat distinct and often antagonistic, the answer is that class consciousness in this sense exists and is more likely to increase than to diminish. A country of newspapers, popular education, and manhood suffrage has passed the stage in which sentiments or interests can flow in separate channels. But there is nothing to prevent the people forming self-assertive groups in reference to economic and social questions, as they do in politics. Class consciousness along these lines will probably increase with growing interest in the underlying controversies, but I do not anticipate that this increase will prove the dreadful thing which some imagine. A class war would indeed be a calamity, but why expect it? I see no reason unless it be a guilty conscience or an unbelief in moral forces. A certain sort of agitators expect and desire a violent struggle because they see privilege defiant, and violence seems to them the shortest way to get at it. And on the other hand, there are many in the enjoyment of privilege who feel in their hearts that they deserve nothing better than to have it taken away from them. But these are naive views that ignore the solidity of the present order, which ensures that any change must be gradual and make its way by reason. Orderly struggle is the time-honored method of adjusting controversies among a free people, and why should we assume that it will degenerate into anarchy and violence at just this point? Will not feeling be rather better than worse when a vague sense of injustice has had a chance to try itself out in a definite and positive self-assertion? It is to be remembered, moreover, that in a society where groups interlace as much as they do with us, a conflict of class interests is, in great degree, not a conflict of persons, but rather one of ideas in a common social medium. Since many persons belong to more than one class, only under conditions of caste would a class war of the sort predicted by some theorist be likely to come to pass. I am not sure that it would be more fantastic to expect a literal war between Democrats and Republicans than between the parties, hardly less united by common social and economic interests of labor and capital. It seems equally mistaken to say, on the one hand, that all class consciousness is bad, or on the other, that we ought above all things to gird ourselves for the class struggle. The just view, apparently, is that we should have in this matter, as elsewhere, difference on a basis of unity. Class loyalty in the pursuit of right ends is good, but like all such sentiments, it should be subordinate to a broad justice and kindness. If there is no class consciousness, men become isolated, degraded, and ineffective. If there is too much or the wrong kind, the group becomes separate and forgets the whole. Let there be diversities of gifts but the same spirit. The present state of things as regards fellowship and cooperation in special groups is, on the whole, one of deficiency rather than excess. The confusion or individualism that we see in literature, art, religion, and industry means a want of the right kind of class unity and spirit. There is a lack of mutual aid and support not only among handworkers, where it is much needed, but also among scholars, artists, professional men, writers, and men of affairs. The ordinary business or professional man hardly feels himself a member of any brotherhood larger than the family. With his wife and children about him, he stands in the midst of a somewhat cold and jostling world, keeping his feet as best he can and seeking a mechanical security in bank account and life insurance. Being less fortunate in this regard, perhaps, than the trades unionist, who has been forced by necessity to stand shoulder to shoulder with his fellows and give and take sacrifice for the common good. And much the same is true of scholars and artists. They are likely not to draw close enough together to keep one another warm and foster the class ideals which lead the individual onto a particular kind of efficiency. There is a lack of those snug nests of special tradition and association in which more settled civilizations are rich. Organization of certain kinds is no doubt more extensive and elaborate than ever before. And organization, it may be said, involves the interdependence, the unity of parts. But will this be a conscious and moral unity? In a high kind of organization it will. But rapid growth may give us a system that is mechanical rather than, in the higher sense, social. When organization quickly extends, there is a tendency to lower its type. As a rubber band becomes thinner the more you stretch it, the relations grow less human, and so may degrade instead of elevating the individual's relation to his whole. In a measure, this has taken place in our life. The vast structure of industry and commerce remains for the most part unhumanized, and whether it proves a real good or not depends upon our success or failure in making it vital, conscious, moral. There is union on a low plane and isolation on a higher. The progress of communication has supplied the mechanical basis for a spiritual organization far beyond anything in the past. But this remains unachieved. On the whole, in the words of Miss Jane Addams, with whom this is a cherished idea, the situation demands the consciousness of participation and well-being, which comes to the individual when he is able to see himself in connection and cooperation with the whole. It needs the solace of collective art inherent in collective labor. It is indeed probable that the growth of class fellowship will help to foster that spirit of art in work, which we so notably lack, and the repose and content which this brings. There is truth in the view that a confused and standardless competition destroys art, which requires not only a group ideal but a certain deliberation, a chance to brood over things and work perfection into them. When the workman is more sure of his position, when he feels his fellows at his shoulder and knows that the quality of his work will be appreciated, he will have more courage and patience to be an artist. We all draw our impulse toward perfection not from vulgar opinion or from our pay, but from the approval of fellow craftsmen. The truth, little seen in our day, is that all work should be done in the spirit of art, and that no society is humanly organized in which this is not chiefly the case. It is also true that closer fellowship, dominated by good ideals, should bring the sympathetic and moral motives to diligence and efficiency into more general action, and relegate the work or starve motive more to the background. Some of us love our work and are eager to do it well. Others have to be driven. Is this because the former are naturally a superior sort of people, because the work itself is essentially more inviting, or because the social conditions are such that sympathy and fellowship are more enlisted with it? Allowing something for the first two, I suspect the third is the principal reason. What work is there that would not be pleasant in moderate quantities, in good fellowship, and in the feeling of service? No great proportion, I imagine, of our task. Washing dishes is not thought desirable, and yet men do it joyfully when they go camping together. Class organization is not, as some people assert, necessarily hostile to freedom. All organization is properly a means through which freedom is sought. As conditions change, men are compelled to find new forms of union through which to express themselves. And the rise of industrial classes is of this nature. In fact, the question of freedom, as applied to class conditions, has two somewhat distinct aspects. These are freedom to rise from one class into another, freedom of individual opportunity, or carrière ouverte au talent. This is chiefly for the man of exceptional capacity and ambition. It is important, but not more so than the other, namely, freedom of classes, or, what is the same thing, of those individuals who have not the wish or power to depart from the sphere of life in which circumstance has placed them. It means justice, opportunity, humane living for the less privileged groups as groups. Not opportunity to get out of them, but to be something in them. A chance for the teamster to have comfort, culture, and good surroundings for himself and his family, without ceasing to be a teamster. The first of these has been much better understood in America than the second. That it is wrong to keep a man down who might rise is quite familiar, but that those who cannot rise or do not care to have also just claims is almost a novel idea, though they are evidently that majority for whom our institutions are supposed to exist. Owing to a too exclusive preoccupation with ideals of enterprise and ambition, a certain neglect and even reproach have rested upon those who do quietly the plain work of life. Ours, if you think of it, is rather too much success on the tontine plan, where one puts all he has into a pool in the hope of being one of a few survivors to get what the rest lose. It would be better to take to heart that idea of Emerson's, that each may succeed in his own way, without putting others down. It is a great thing that every American boy may aspire to be president of the United States or of the Standard Oil Company, but it is equally important that he should have a chance for full and wholesome life in the more probable condition of clerk or mill hand. While we must admire the heroes of Samuel Smiles, we may remember that they do and should constitute only a small minority of the human race. And the main guarantee for freedom of this latter sort is some kind of class organization, which shall resist the encroachment and neglect of which the weaker parties in society are in constant danger. Those who have wealth, position, knowledge, leisure, may perhaps dispense with formal organization, though in fact it is those who are strong already who most readily extend their strength in this way. But the multitudes who have nothing but their human nature to go upon must evidently stand together or go to the wall. Where classes do not mean separate currents of thought, as in the case of caste, but are merely differentiations in a common mental whole, there are likely to be several kinds of classes overlapping one another, so that men who fall in the same class from one point of view are separated in another. The groups are like circles which, instead of standing apart, interlace with one another so that several of them may pass through the same individual. Classes become numerous and, so to speak, impersonal. That is, each one absorbs only a part of the life of the individual and does not sufficiently dominate him to mold him to a special type. This is one of the things that distinguish our American order from that, say, of Germany, where caste is still so dominant as to carry many other differences with it and create unmistakable types of men. As a newspaper writer puts it, the one thing we may be sure of every day is that not a man whom we shall meet in it will belong to his type. It is, however, upon the grosser and more obvious differences of wealth and rank, and not upon intellectual or moral traits, that classes, in the ordinary meaning of the word, are based. The reasons for this are, first, that something obvious and unquestionable is requisite as a symbol and unfailing mark of class. And second, that the tangible distinctions alone are usual matters of controversy. Culture and character have more intrinsic importance, but are too uncertain to mark a class, and even if they were stamped upon the forehead, they are not matter to quarrel over like wealth or titles. Since those who have them not cannot hope to get them by depriving those who have. Income, for instance, classifies people through creating different standards of living, those who fall into the same class in this respect being likely to adopt about the same external mode of life. It usually decides whether men live in one quarter of the city or another, what sort of houses or apartments they inhabit, how they dress, whether the wife does all her own work or employs household help, and if the latter, how much and of what sort, whether they keep a carriage, whether they go into the country for the summer, whether they travel abroad, whether they send their sons to college, and so on. And such likeness leads to likeness of ideas, especially in that commonplace sort of people, the most numerous, of course, who have not sufficient definiteness or energy of character to associate on any other basis. Note how difficult it is for two people, congenial in other respects, to converse freely when one has an income of $5,000, the other of $500. Few topics can be touched upon without accentuating the superficial but troublesome discrepancy. Amusements, household, and the like are hardly possible. The weather may supply a remark or two, perhaps also politics, though here the economic point of view is likely to appear. Religion or philosophy, if the parties could soar so high, would be best of all. Of course, serious discussion should be all the more practicable and fruitful because of difference of viewpoint. What I mean, however, is light, offhand, sociable talk that does not stir any depths. As between their wives, the situation would be harder still, and only an unusual tact and magnanimity would make it tolerable. The result is that we ordinarily find it most comfortable to associate on a basis of income, combined with and modified by the influence of occupation, culture, and special tastes. And yet to do this is perhaps a confession of failure, a confession that we do not know how to cast off the adventitious and meet as men. The most superficial differences, being the most apparent, impose themselves upon our commonly indolent and sensuous states of mind. In proportion to their energy, men will always seek power. It is perhaps the deepest of instincts, resting directly on the primary need for self-expression. But the kind of power sought will take many forms. Wealth stands in modern society for nearly all the grosser and more tangible forms, for power over material goods primarily, and secondarily over the more purchasable kinds of human activity. Hand labor, professional services, newspaper commendation, political assiduity, and so on. The class that has it is, in all such matters, the strong class, and naturally our coarser thought concludes that this is the kind of power most worth consideration. In all the obvious details of life, in that seeking for petty advantages and immunities in which most of our time is passed, at the store or the railway station, we are measured by money and are apt to measure others so. The ascendancy of wealth is too natural to disappear. Children prize possessions before they can talk, and readily learn that money is possession generalized. Indeed, only the taste for finer possessions can or should drive out that for lower. And yet all clear minds, or rather all minds in their clearer moments, may see that wealth is not the chief good that the commonplace and superficial estimate makes it. It is simply a low form of power, important in measure to the group and to the individual, but easily preoccupying the mind beyond its just claim. If society gets material prosperity too fast, its spiritual life suffers, as is somewhat the case in our day, and the individual is in peril of moral isolation and decay as soon as he seeks to get richer than his fellows. The finest and, in the long run, the most influential minds have for the most part not cared for riches, or not cared enough to go out of their way to seek them, preferring to live on bare necessities if they must, rather than spend their lives in an uncongenial scramble. And the distinctively spiritual leaders have always regarded them as inconsistent with their aims. Provide neither gold, nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, neither two coats, neither shoes, nor yet staves. Not that Christianity is opposed to industrial prosperity, the contrary is the case, but that Christian leadership required the explicit renunciation of prosperity's besetting sin. In our day, the life of Thoreau, among others, illustrates how a man may have the finer products of wealth, the culture of all times, while preferring to remain individually poor. He held that for an unmarried student, wishing first of all to preserve the independence of his mind, occasional day labor, which one can do and have done with, is the best way of getting a living. A man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone. It makes but little difference whether you are committed to a farm or the county jail. The thoroughgoing way in which this doctrine is developed in his Walden and other books makes them a vade mecum for the impecunious idealist. Professor William James asserts that the prevalent fear of poverty among the educated classes is the worst moral disease from which civilization suffers, paralyzing their ideal force. Think of the strength which personal indifference to poverty would give us if we were devoted to unpopular causes. We need no longer hold our tongues or fear to vote the revolutionary or reformatory ticket. Our stocks might fall, our hopes of promotion vanish, our salaries stop, our club doors close in our faces. Yet, while we lived, we would imperturbably bear witness to the Spirit, and our example would help to set free our generation. If these considerations do not keep us from greed, it is because most of us have only flashes of the higher ambition. We may believe that we could reconcile ourselves to poverty if we had to, even that it might be good for us, but we do our best to avoid it. For the ill-paid classes, certainly, the desire for money does not mean materialism in any reproachful sense, but is chiefly the means by which they hope to realize, first, health and decency, and then a better chance at the higher life. Books, leisure, education, and refinement. They are necessarily materialized in a certain sense by the fact that their most strenuous thought must be fixed upon work and product in relation to material needs. It is in those who are already well-to-do that the preoccupation with money is most degrading, as not justified by primary wants. Meat is sweetest when it is nearest the bone, and it is good to long and strive for money when you have an urgent human need for it. But to do this for accumulation, luxury, or a remote security is not wholesome. This cold-blooded storing up in banks and tin boxes is perilous to the soul, often becoming a kind of secret vice, a disease of narrow minds, feeble imaginations, and contracted living. In modern life, then, and in a country without formal privilege, the question of classes is practically one of wealth, and of occupation considered in relation to wealth. The reason being not that this distinction really dominates life, but that it is the focus of the more definite and urgent class controversies. Other aims are pursued in peace. Wealth, because it is material and appropriable, involves conflict. We may then accept the economic standpoint for this purpose without at all agreeing with those who regard it as more fundamental than others. Since in our age commerce and industry absorb most of the practical energy of the people, the men that are foremost in these activities have a certain ascendancy, similar to that of warriors in a military age. Although this sort of men is not sharply marked off, it is well enough indicated by the term capitalist or capitalist manager class. The large owner of capital being usually more or less of a manager also, while the large salaries and other gains of successful managers soon make them capitalists. It is not quite accurate to speak of the group in question as the rich because, at a given time, a large part of its most vigorous membership is as yet without wealth, though in a way to get it. And, on the other hand, many of the actual possessors of wealth are personally idle or ineffective. The essential thing is a social tendency or a system of ideas generated in the accumulation of wealth and having for its nucleus the more active and successful leaders of commerce and industry. That these are a very small class in proportion to their power is apparent, but not, perhaps, in itself, so fatal a defect in the system that permits it as many imagine. Insofar as concentration of control means that wealth is in the hands of those who understand how to use it for the common good, and do in fact so use it, much may be said in its favor. We are all eager to entrust our property to those who will make it profitable to us, and society, under any system that could be devised, must probably do the same. But we may well ask whether there is not some more adequate means than we now have of getting this trust faithfully executed. For better or for worse, concentration is probably inevitable in any society that has a vast, mobile wealth subject to competition. And the actual inequality is perhaps not much greater than that of political power, which is supposed to be equally distributed by general suffrage. The truth is that equality of power or influence in any sphere of life is inconsistent with the free working of human forces, which is ever creating differences, some of which are useful to society and some harmful. A true freedom, a reasonable equality, aims to conserve the former and abolish or limit the latter. The sentiment of the class is not aristocratic in the ordinary sense. Although its members endeavor to secure their possessions to their children, there's little of the spirit of hereditary caste, which, indeed, is uncongenial to commerce. Freedom of opportunity is the ideal in this, as in other parts of American society, and educational or other opportunities designed to maintain or increase it are sincerely approved and supported. There is, in fact, an almost inevitable dualism, which makes it natural that a man should strive to aggrandize himself, his family, and his class, even though he truly wishes for greater equality of privilege. He floats on two currents, and as a man and a brother may be glad of restraints upon his own class, which are in the interest of justice. The ideal of freedom prevalent in the managing class is, however, somewhat narrow and hardly hospitable to the group self-assertion of the less privileged classes. The labor movement has made its way by its energy and reasonableness in the face of a rather general mistrust and opposition, sometimes justified by its aberrations, on the part of the masters of industry. Yet even in this regard, as it comes to be seen that organization is an element of fair play, and as experience shows that union may become an instrument of stability, a broader sentiment makes headway. Like everything else that has power in human life, the money-strong represent in some sense the survival of the fittest, not necessarily of the best. That is, their success, certainly no guarantee of righteousness, does prove a certain adaptation to conditions, those who get rich being in general the ablest for this purpose, of the many who devote their energies to it with about the same opportunities. They are not necessarily the ablest in other regards, since only certain kinds of ability count in making money. Other kinds, and those often the highest, such as devotion to intellectual or moral ideals, being even a hindrance. Men of genius will seldom shine in this way because, as a rule, only a somewhat commonplace mind will give itself wholeheartedly to the commercial ideal. There is much likeness in the persons and methods by which, in all ages, the cruder sort of power is acquired. When the military system is ascendant over the industrial, it is acquired in one way, when property is secure from force in another, but this makes less difference than might be supposed. In either case, it is not mere personal prowess, with the sword or with the tool, that gains large success, but power in organization. Aggressiveness, single-minded devotion to the end, and above all, organizing faculty. These were the methods of Clovis and Pepin and William of Normandy, as they are of our rulers of finance. And now, as formerly, much of the power that is alive in such men falls by inheritance into weaker hands. As to righteousness in the sense of good intention, they probably do not on the whole differ much from the average. Some may be found of the highest character, some of gross unscrupulousness. The majority are doubtless without moral distinction, and take the color of their associates. The view sometimes set forth on behalf of men of wealth that riches go with virtue, and the view more popular among non-possessors that it comes by wickedness, are equally untrustworthy. The great mass of wealth is accumulated by solid qualities, energy, tenacity, shrewdness, and the like, which may coexist with great moral refinement or with the opposite. As a group, however, they are liable to moral deficiencies, analogous to those of the conquerors and organizers of states just referred to. There is especially a certain moral irresponsibility which is natural to those who have broken away from customary limitations and restraints and are coursing almost at will over an unfenced territory. I mean that business enterprise, like military enterprise, deals largely with relations as to which there are no settled rules of morality, no constraining law or public opinion. Such conditions breed in the ordinary actor a Machiavellian opportunism. Since it is hard to say what is just and honest in the vast and abstract operations of finance, human nature is apt to cease looking for a standard, and to seize booty wherever and however it safely can. Hence the truly piratical character of many of our great transactions. And in smaller matters also, as in escaping taxation, it is often fatally easy for the rich to steal. It must be allowed that such ascendancy as the capitalist class has rests, in part at least, upon service. That is to say, its members have had an important function to perform, and in performing that function, have found themselves in a position to grasp wealth. The great work of the time has been, or has seemed to be, the extension and reconstruction of industry. In this work, leadership and organization have been needed on a great scale, and our captains of industry have nobly met this demand. That their somewhat autocratic control of production was called for by the situation seems to be shown by the rather general failure of cooperative enterprises intended to dispense with it. Why is it that America abounds in opportunity, and that every sort of industrial capacity is eagerly sought out and rewarded? Of course, natural advantages play a great part, but much must also be ascribed to the energy and imaginative daring of our entrepreneurs, many of whom have spent great faculty and tireless zeal upon business in a spirit of adventure and achievement rather than of gain. Where the general is aggressive, the soldier will be kept busy. I have no sympathy with the general abuse of commercialism, but hold with Montesquieu that the spirit of commerce is naturally attended with that of frugality, economy, moderation, labor, prudence, tranquility, order, and rule. So long as this spirit subsists, the riches it produces have no ill effect. The mischief is when excessive wealth destroys the spirit of commerce. Then it is that the inconveniences of inequality begin to be felt. The conception of keen adaptation of means to ends, of exact social workmanship, inculcated by business is of untold value to our civilization, and capable of very general application. It is a very proper demand that government, education, and philanthropy should, in this sense, be conducted on business principles. At the same time, it is plain that a large part of the accumulation of wealth, hard, unfortunately, to distinguish from other parts, is accomplished not by social service, but, as just intimated, by something akin to piracy. This is not so much the peculiar wickedness of a predatory class as a tendency in all of us to abuse power when not under definite legal or moral control. The vast transactions associated with modern industry have come very little under such control, and offer a field for freebooting such as the world has never seen. Nor need we affirm that even the gains of the great organizers are in the highest sense right, only that they are natural and do not necessarily involve conscious wrongdoing. The question of the rather arbitrary control of industry by the capitalist manager, which now prevails, and of the possibility of this control being diminished or modified in the future, calls for some analysis of underlying forces. Evidently, there is a conflict of principles here, the democratic or popular and the autocratic. The latter, now ascendant, has the advantages of concentration, secrecy, and promptness, the same which give it superiority in war. On the other hand, the democratic principle should have the same merit in industry and commerce that it has in politics, namely that of enlisting the pride and ambition of the individual and so getting him to put himself into his work. Other things being equal, a free system is a more vital and energetic organism than one in which the initiative and choice come from a central authority. And it is apparent that the working of the autocratic system in our economic life shows just the strength and weakness that would naturally be expected. The prompt undertaking and execution of vast schemes at a favorable moment, and the equally prompt recession when conditions alter. The investment of great resources in enterprises which yield no immediate return. The decision and secrecy important in overcoming competitors. The unhesitating sacrifice of workmen and their families when the market calls for a shutdown of production. Such traits as these are of the utmost importance to commercial success, and belong to arbitrary control rather than to anything of a more popular sort. On the other hand, it would be easy to show at any length desired that such control is accompanied by a widespread disaffection of spirit on the part of the working classes, which, expressed in unwilling labor, strikes, and agitation, is a commercial disadvantage and a social problem so urgent as to unsettle the whole economic system. The autocratic system has evidently a special advantage in a time of rapid and confused development, when conditions are little understood or regulated, and the state of things is one of somewhat blind and ruthless warfare. But it is quite possible that as the new industries become established and comparatively stable, there will be a commercial as well as a social demand for a system that shall invite and utilize more of the goodwill and self-activity of the workman. The system which comes nearest to calling out all the self-interest and using all the faculties and sharing all the benefits will outcompete any system that strikes a lower level of motive, faculty, and profit. And the penetrating thinker who wrote this sentence believed that the function of the autocratic captain of industry was essentially that of an explorer and conqueror of new domains, destined to come later under the rule of a commonwealth. Indeed, the rise, on purely commercial grounds, of a more humane and individualizing tendency, aiming in one way or another to propitiate the self-feeling of the workman and get him to identify himself with his work, is well ascertained. Among the familiar phases of this are the notable growth of cooperative production and exchange in Belgium, Russia, and other European countries, the increasing respect for labor unions, and the development by large concerns of devices for insurance, for pensions, for profit sharing, and for the material and social comfort of their employees. In some form or other, the democratic principle is sure to make its way into the economic system. Cooperation, labor unions, public regulation, public ownership, and the informal control of opinion will no doubt all have a part. The general outcome being that the citizen becomes a more vital agent in the life of the whole. Before discussing further the power of the capitalist manager class, we ought to think out clearly just what is meant by social power. Evidently, the essence of it is control over the human spirit, and the most direct phases of power are immediately spiritual, such as one mind exercises over another by virtue of what it is, without any means but the ordinary symbols of communication. This is live, human power, and those who have it in great degree are the prime movers of society, whether they gain any more formal or conventional sort or not. Such, for instance, are the poets, prophets, philosophers, inventors, and men of science of all ages, the great political, military, and religious organizers, and even the real captains of industry and commerce. All power involves in its origin mental or spiritual force of some sort. And so far as it attaches to passive attributes like hereditary social position, offices, bank accounts, and the like, it does so through the aid of conventions and habits, which regard these things as repositories of spiritual force and allow them to exercise its function. In its immediate spiritual phase, power is at a maximum of vitality and a minimum of establishment. Only a few can recognize it. Its possessors, then, strive to establish and organize it, to give it social expression and efficacy, to gain position, reputation, or wealth. Since power is not apparent to the common mind until it takes on these forms, they are, to superficial observation and in all the conventional business of life, the only valid evidence of it. And yet by the time these symbols appear, the spiritual basis has often passed away. Primary power goes for the most part unseen, much of it taking on no palpable form until late in life, much yielding only posthumous reputation, and that perhaps the finest sort, having never any vulgar recognition whatever. Regarding money value, we may say in general that it is one expression of the conventional or institutional phase of society, and exhibits all that mixture of grandeur and confusion with which nature usually presents herself to understanding. Its appraisal of men and things is partly expressive of great principles, and partly, so far as can be seen, unjust, trivial, or accidental. Some gains are vital or organic, springing from the very nature of life and justified as we come to understand that life. Some are fanciful, springing from the tastes or whims of the rich, like the value of diamonds or first editions, and some parasitical, like those of the legally protected swindler. In general, the values of the market are those of the habitual world in all its grossness. Spiritual values, except those that have become conventional, being little felt in it. These appeal to the future. The detailed working of market value has no ascertainable connection with moral worth, and we must not expect it to have. If a man's work is moral in the higher sense, it is in its nature an attack upon the habitual world, which the latter is more likely to resent than reward. One can only take up that useful work that seems best suited to him, trying to be content if its value is small, and, if large, to feel that the power over money it gives him is rightly his only insofar as he uses it for the general good. The more tangible kind of social power, so far as it is intrinsic to the man and not adventitious like inherited wealth, depends chiefly upon organizing capacity, which may be described as the ability to build and operate human machinery. It has its roots in tact and skill in dealing with men, in tenacity, and in a certain instinct for construction. One who possesses it sees a new person as social material, and is likely to know what can be made of him better than he knows himself. Of all kinds of leadership, this has the readiest recognition and the highest market value. And naturally so, since it is essential to every sort of cooperative achievement. Its possessors understand the immediate control of the world, which they will exercise no matter what the apparent forms of organization may be. In all ages, they have gained and held the grosser forms of power, whenever these were at all open to competition. Thus, during the early Middle Age, men of energy and management, more or less favored by situation, built up for themselves local authority and estate, or perhaps exploited the opportunities for still wider organization, like the founders of Burgundy and Brittany and the early kings of France. Very much in the same manner as men of our own day build up commercial and industrial systems and become senators and railway presidents. Indeed, this type of ability was never in such demand as it now is for the conduct of the vast and diverse social structures rising about us, industrial enterprises, political parties, labor unions, newspapers, universities, and philanthropies. It has its high money value partly because of its rarity and partly because there is a regular market for it, the need being so urgent and obvious as to create a steady and intelligent demand. In this latter respect, it contrasts with services like moral leadership, which people need but will seldom pay for. A third reason is that its possessors are almost always clever enough to know their own value and secure its recognition. In discussing the power of the capitalist class, there is no question of the finer and higher forms of power. We shall rarely find among the rich any pregnant spiritual leadership, theirs being a pedestrian kind of authority which has a great deal to do with the everyday comfort of their contemporaries, but does not attempt to sway the profounder destinies of the race, nor does the world often accord them enduring fame. Lacking spiritual significance, their names are written water. Even in industry, the creative thought, the inventions which are the germs of a new era, seldom come from money winners, since they require a different kind of insight. The capitalist represents power over those social values that are tangible and obvious enough to have a definite standing in the market. His money and prestige will command food, houses, clothes, tools, and all conventional and standard sorts of personal service, from lawn mowing to the administration of a railroad, not genius or love or anything of that nature. That wealth means social power of this coarser sort is apparent in a general way, and yet merits a somewhat closer examination. We have first its immediate power over goods and services. The master of riches goes attended by an invisible army of potential servitors, ready to do for him anything that the law allows and often more. He is in this way, as in so many others, the successor of the noblemen of medieval and early modern history, who went about with a band of visible retainers eager to work his will upon all opposers. He is the ruler of a social system wherever he may be. The political power of wealth is due only in part to direct corruption, vast as that is, but is even more an indirect and perfectly legal pressure in the shape of inducements which its adroit use can always bring to bear. Trade to the businessman, practice to the lawyer, and employment to the handworker. Everyone, when he thinks of his income, wishes to conciliate the rich. Influence of this sort makes almost every rich man a political power, even without his especially wishing to be. But when wealth is united to a shrewd and unscrupulous political ambition, when it sets out to control legislation or the administration of the laws, it becomes truly perilous. We cannot fail to see that a large part of our high offices are held by men who have no marked qualification but wealth, and would be insignificant without it. Also that our legislation, municipal, state, and national, and most of our administrative machinery, feel constantly the grasp of pecuniary power. Probably it is not too much to say that except when public opinion is unusually aroused, wealth can generally have its way in our politics if it makes an effort to do so. As to the influence of the rich over the professional classes, lawyers, doctors, clergymen, teachers, civil and mechanical engineers, and the like, we may say in general that it is potent but somewhat indirect, implying not conscious subservience but a moral ascendancy through habit and suggestion. The abler men of this sort are generally educated and self-respecting, have a good deal of professional spirit, and are not wholly dependent upon any one employer. At the same time, they get their living largely through the rich, from whom the most lucrative employment comes, and who have many indirect ways of making and marring careers. The ablest men in the legal profession are in close relations with the rich and commonly become capitalists themselves. Physicians are more independent because their art is not directly concerned with property, yet look to wealthy patients for their most profitable practice. Clergymen are under pressure to satisfy wealthy parishioners, and teachers must win the goodwill of the opulent citizens who control educational boards. Now, there is nothing in social psychology surer than that if there is a man by whose goodwill we desire to profit, we are likely to adapt our way of thinking to his. Impelled to imagine frequently his state of mind and to desire that it should be favorable to our aims, we are unconsciously swayed by his thought, the more so if he treats us with a courtesy which does not alarm our self-respect. It is in this way that wealth imposes upon intellect. Who can deny it? Newspapers are generally owned by men of wealth, which has no doubt an important influence upon the sentiments expressed in them. But a weightier consideration is the fact that they depend for profit chiefly upon advertisements, the most lucrative of which come from rich merchants who naturally resent doctrines that threaten their interest. Of course, the papers must reach the people in order to have a value for advertising or any other purpose, and this requires adaptation to public opinion. But the public of what are known as the better class of papers are chiefly the comparatively well-to-do. And even that portion of the press which aims to please the hand-working class is usually more willing to carry on a loud but vague agitation, not intended to accomplish anything but increase circulation, than to push real and definite reform. All phases of opinion, including the most earnest and honest inquiry into social questions, find some voice in print, but, leaving aside times when public opinion is greatly aroused, those phases that are backed by wealthy interest have a great advantage in the urgency, persistence, and cleverness with which they are presented. At least this has been the case in the past. It is a general feeling of thoughtful men among the hand-working class that it is hard to get a really fair statement of their view of industrial questions from that portion of the newspaper and magazine press that is read by well-to-do people. The reason seems to be mainly that the writers live unconsciously in an atmosphere of upper-class ideas from which they do not free themselves by thorough inquiry. Besides this, there is a sense of what their readers expect, and also perhaps a vague feeling that the sentiments of the hand-working class may threaten public order. Since the public has supplanted the patron, a man of letters has least of all to hope or fear from the rich, if he accepts the opinion that the latter can do nothing toward making or marring a new book. The power of wealth over public sentiment is exercised partly through sway over the educated classes in the press, but also by the more direct channel of prestige. Minds of no great insight, that is to say the majority, mold their ideals from the spectacle of visible and tangible success. In a commercial epoch, this pertains to the rich, who consequently add to the other sources of their influence power over the imagination. Millions accept the money-making ideal who are unsuited to attain it, and run themselves out of breath and courage in a race they should never have entered. It is as if the thin-legged and flat-chested people of the land should seek glory in football. The money game is mere foolishness and mortification for most of us, and there is a madness of the crowd in the way we enter into it. Even those who most abuse the rich commonly show mental subservience in that they assume that the rich have, in fact, gotten what is best worth having. As hinted above, there is such a thing as an upper-class atmosphere, in the sense of a state of mind regarding social questions, initiated by the more successful money winners and consciously or unconsciously imposed upon business and professional people at large. Most of us exist in this atmosphere and are so pervaded by it that it is not easy for us to understand or fairly judge the sentiment of the hand-working classes. The spokesmen of radical doctrines are, in this regard, doing good service to the public mind by setting in motion counterbalancing, if not more trustworthy, currents of opinion. If anyone of business or professional antecedents doubts that he breathes a class atmosphere, let him live for a time at a social settlement in the industrial part of one of our cities. Not a real escape, but as near it as most of us have the resolution to achieve. Reading working class literature, talking with handworking people, attending meetings, and in general, opening his mind as wide as possible to the influences about him. He will presently become aware of being in a new medium of thought and feeling, which may or may not be congenial but cannot fail to be instructive. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you will be notified when new videos are out. Also, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find many other fundamental advertising and psychology books in different languages. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.